Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the virtual edition of our annual Words the Orangeville Way event. My name is Lauren Tilley, and I am the Program and Research Librarian here at the Orangeville Public Library. 2020 has been difficult, stressful, and uncertain for most. A focus on mental health, well-being, resiliency, and overcoming hardship is needed now more than ever. And although we cannot sit together in a room and enjoy this discussion today, I'm happy that we can bring it to you in the comfort of your home. I will mention that some of our discussion subject matter today is a bit traumatic. So if you are a survivor or you've experienced abuse in the past or something traumatic, this might be triggering to you. So I did want to disclaim that. You'll notice we have our speakers in the library today. You will see that they are 6 feet apart, and they have a plexiglass barrier in the middle of them, just as a precaution to keep everyone safe while providing you at home the best viewing experience. So we are pleased to be hosting today's event in partnership with our local independent bookstore, Booklore, and with the support of the Headwaters Writers Guild. I would like to take a moment to give a special thank you to Nancy from Booklore for helping us find the perfect author to feature, and another special thank you to Dufferin County Poet Laureate, wordsmith, and interviewer extraordinaire, Harry Posner, for his generosity in moderating today's discussion. It is my pleasure to introduce Harry to those who may not be familiar with his work. Harry has a degree in psychology from York University. He is an independently published and published poet, author, and editor who also teaches creative writing. We have been very fortunate to have Harry do a number of workshops here at the library for us. He has authored 3 novels, collections of fiction and poetry, and most recently a novella that won him the Ken Klonsky Novella Award. In 2017, Harry was named Dufferin County's first ever Poet Laureate and has excelled in this role. As a cultural ambassador, Harry has brought our community memorable events such as the annual Day of the Poets. And without further ado, I will hand it over to your very capable hands, Harry, to get us started and introduce everyone to today's featured author, Catherine Gildiner.
Thank you, Lauren. It's great to be here talking to Catherine today. By way of introduction, author, memoirist, columnist, novelist, screenwriter, and clinical psychologist. These are just a few of the hats worn by our celebrated guest, Catherine Gildiner. American-born, Catherine now resides here in Canada, dividing her time between Toronto and Creemore, and we are thrilled to have her join us here in Orangeville today. Catherine's first book, a humorous memoir entitled Too Close to the Falls, was published in 1999 after a friend encouraged her to, quote, write down all the crazy stories she had from her childhood, unquote. That book went on to become internationally acclaimed, spending 70 weeks on bestseller lists. Since then, Catherine has written 2 more best-selling memoirs, After the Falls and Coming Ashore, a novel entitled Seduction, which is described as an intellectual thriller, and her latest book, Good Morning Monster, which we are looking forward to exploring more today with her. After receiving an MA in English Literature, an MA in Psychology, and a PhD in Psychology, Catherine went on to hold a private practice in clinical psychology for 25 years. Her experiences over those years of practice helped her craft this unique book. With a novelist's storytelling gift, Good Morning Monster follows the heroic journey of 5 of Catherine's patients as they overcome trauma and exemplify resiliency, while detailing her own personal growth as a therapist. It is my pleasure, my great pleasure, to welcome you here today, Catherine, and thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you. It's great to be here.
Now, as we know, these are unprecedented times. We're living through a global pandemic. Mm-hmm. People are going crazy at all kinds of levels, right? And so this book, in some ways, is very appropriate, the timing of it. Can you talk about how you came to write the book, and in particular, why you chose the word heroic in the title?
Right. I actually can remember the moment when I thought of this book about writing this book about 20 years ago. I was at my high school reunion in the US, And I went to a very big high school, and it had 1,600 in my class, and we all had to stand up and give a standing ovation and clap for the boy or who was in our class who won the Medal of Honor, the Purple Medal of Honor, and got his medal from the president. And so everyone talked about what an incredible hero he was, et cetera. Now I'm not against the military in any way. I mean, we didn't want Hitler sitting in the White House in the 40s. I mean, I get it. We have to defend our land, et cetera. But I thought it's so interesting that they keep calling him a hero when in fact he was in battle for 3 hours, right? And I mean, I'm not saying what he definitely was a hero, but I thought I've seen more heroic behavior in my practice than General Patton ever saw in World War II. Because I mean, people don't understand that when your family is traumatizing you and your parents are against you, you're a prisoner of war. You're there for your whole lifetime, right? And for your formative years, it's like John McCain said, well, I was, he was a prisoner of war for a matter of months, right? And then he said, but while I was there, I said to myself all the time, what would my parents say? How would I, trying to build himself up. Well, when you're in a family that's traumatizing you, you don't have any parents to turn to because they're your enemies, and you're there from birth to 18.
Yeah.
So I thought, I really want to write about these people. And it was interesting because my father had cancer when I was 12, and everyone in our family said, never say the word cancer. This would be in the late 50s. Never say the word cancer. It's awful. Don't, because I said to somebody, my father has cancer, and my mother said, never say that. Oh my God, that's horrible. So I want now people say cancer all the time. My father has cancer, I had cancer, whatever. It's come out of the closet, and they've done a wonderful job with bringing it out of the closet. And I want to do the same thing with trauma, because if people knew what people went through with trauma, they'd see them as heroes. Those that come out sane are heroes.
Yeah. In some respects, we're all heroes, having been raised in families that are dysfunctional to one degree or another.
Amazing. Right? When you look at all the dysfunction, it's incredible that we walk and talk.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Wow. Now, before we get into the nitty-gritty of what's in the book, the general focus of your therapy, as you said it in the book, was to enhance people's lives. Mm-hmm. That was what you kind of a very succinct way of putting it. Mm-hmm. At the same time, through the book, you reveal moments where you went, oh my God, I made the mistake. I made a mistake here. Why did I do that? Mm-hmm. Sometimes big mistakes, sometimes small mistakes, which I thought was really interesting and really informative in a way. Can you talk about one of those aha moments from the book where you realized you really went off the rails as a therapist?
Right. I think that oddly enough, it would be with my last case, Madeline, where you would think you would be your first case, where you're still learning, right? Yes. But I think sometimes in your last case, you're too cocky, and you take shortcuts. Yes. You're not as conscientious. You think, oh, I've been doing this a long time. I can handle this. I can handle that. Not true, right? Mm-hmm. You have to go as slowly as you went for the first patient, because you have to realize that defense mechanisms are they're like an onion. You have to peel them off tiny layer by tiny layer. If you confront someone and say, I know what's wrong with you, and then you cut the onion in half, it doesn't help. Then they build up more and more defenses. They're terrified, and they aren't able to move forward. So that's what happened in my Madeline case, because I think part of the reason for my mistake there was that I flew to New York to see her once a week. This was after I had retired in Toronto. So I was not on my home turf. Right. So the people with her assistants would open the door and say, you've got to get her better. We're all going to lose our jobs. We're all, because nobody can fly and nobody can take things up. Please work really hard today. And then they close the door. And
no pressure, right?
I'd be like, oh my God. Right? So, she had this phobia about flying, and literally her whole business was going under because they all had to fly places. And so I said, I know why this is. And then I blurted it out. You're in love with this guy. He thinks, blah, blah, blah. I went through this. And then she said, get out. So I had to pack up. And I was in New York. So, I had to kill hours before my plane. Right. But she was right in the sense that I I jumped the gun, and you can't do that in therapy because it's kind of a beginner's mistake. A beginner's mistake is when you're a therapist and you want to prove that you know things, right? You want to prove you have insight, that you're worth it, right? That's what, when anybody goes into a new job, they try to prove they're worth it, right? So where someone says, I feel anxious around my father, you say, well, I know why that is, because last week you said blah, blah, blah. You can't do that, right? It may make you look good, but it's very frightening for them. And you have to feel it out bit by bit, week after week, and say, because when something happens, you then build up all kinds of calluses and defenses, and your whole brain does that. So if you're going to cut through it, you're just going to have a cut up mess, right? So so I would say that was definitely a big mistake.
So is there a kind of requirement for a therapist to kind of access their feminine listening side? Because the directing side of, I know what's wrong with you, and it seems to be very male, oriented kind of way of responding. Would you have to?
I think I have way more of that male side. So what I do is I try really hard not to listen, because I listen anyway. I'm a good listener, right?
Yeah.
And I file it all away. I'm pretty good at that. But my major foible is saying, here's what you're doing, cut it out, right? Like that, that kind of thing, where you just think, oh, they're suffering so much, don't they see this? But as the years go by, I thought the more you do that, the longer the therapy, right?
Right.
So I learned my lesson. Right?
Okay.
Yeah.
What was interesting too is, as I worked through the book with each of these 5 clients, I guess is the proper term, was that you seem to feel free to move from working with a kind of Gestalt therapy approach on one session to Rogerian therapy to Freudian psychoanalysis. You kind of to working with indigenous elders in Danny's case.
Yes,
right?
yes.
Is that unusual for therapists to do that, or is that something that's more particular to yourself?
You know what's horrible about being a therapist? There's lots of horrible things, but one of them is that you're locked in your office all day long and you don't see other people doing therapy. So you can't compare yourself to a lot of other people. You can read books, but you don't know what people are really doing in their office, right? So all you can be is sort of true to yourself. And I think that anybody who says, I'm in private practice and I'm a Rogerian, or I'm in private practice and I'm a Freudian, I think, wow, you have never had patients get better. Right? Yeah. Because what Freud is very perfect for a certain kind of heavily intellectualized type of person, right? But for someone who has had hardly any parenting or any love, they can't even open up to be introspective in the Freudian way. They need a Rogerian parent who can be loving to them and kind and say what you think matters. So it really depends who's in front of you. Anybody that it's very easy, because when I was in academia, I did some teaching of psychology. I'd say, this would be a Freudian interview. This would be Rogerian. This would be Gestalt, right? In fact, you really have to use them all, and you have to pick the moment. You have to say, okay, this is floundering. I've got to switch on to something else. Like there's the Danny moment with the Gestalt. Gestalt is where whatever happens between the therapist and the client is also what's happening in the outside world. We're just a microcosm of the macrocosm, right? So for instance, when Danny said, why do you think I kept getting sexually molested at this residential school? I said, I think it's like chickens. It's like a fox in the hen house. They're going to choose the most handsome, the biggest. He said, I'm out of here. And he left.
Right.
So actually, the man who was paying for his therapy, his boss, made him come back. But then I spent a lot of time doing a whole Gestalt thing of what happened in our interaction. I don't want to hear about the past. I don't want to hear about the future. I want to know what happened here. And of course, it turned out he had never talked about what had really happened to him. But it was this priest who was very helpful to him, who took him to the 4-H club, who actually taught him a tremendous amount about reading, etc., was also sexually molesting him. And he would start out with the line, "You're very handsome." So he said to me, you should never have used that word. That's not a word that a therapist should use. So I said, well, actually, I'm trying to think of another word. I guess I could say tall. I could say large. I mean, but also it feeds into the native thing, because as I was really lost with Danny, my native client, and he didn't speak for 2 months when he came to therapy, right? So
Yes.
yeah. So I thought, but he still came, right? So the more I talked to him, then the more he backed up. It was like we were doing this dance, right?
Yes.
So finally I said, okay, I've got to be quiet too. But then I finally said, okay, this isn't going anywhere. I've got to find a native psychiatrist. This goes back 30 years. There was one at Harvard, none in Canada, not one native psychiatrist. So I'd love to publish my next book on our correspondence. He was so kind to me. He wrote this is back before computers, right? He would write letters and say, you know, the word handsome is something that a native would never say to another native. Like, it's very intimate. It's an intimate term.
Right.
And you know, he said, if you went to a party and someone said to you, hi, how's your sex life? You'd be like, whoa, 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 this is way too intimate. He said, that's how most natives feel all the time talking to white people, because they have a greater sense of privacy, and that you would only talk in a certain way to a very few people that you're intimate with. So, you know, so there was a lot of things that went wrong in that handsome thing. But I was able, because I used that Gestalt system, he didn't want to talk about it. And I kept going back to how I felt and how did he feel, right? And that really worked in that moment in time.
Okay, let's stay with Danny for a second.
Okay.
He's fascinating as a client. Yeah. You talk about periods where you two are sitting for like 15, 20 minutes, a half an hour, and no words are being exchanged.
None.
Total silence.
Total silence.
In the therapy room. What the heck were you doing during those 30 minutes inwardly? I'm curious.
Okay, so I first of all, I'm the most talkative person in North America, right? So that makes it hard for me when, you know, he is the least talkative, right?
Yeah.
But he taught me a lot. I learned to sit there and to try, and as the doctor, the native doctor had said to me, sit with yourself and try to feel what Danny is feeling. Get to know Danny by sitting there. And I thought, seriously, okay. But you know what? If you do it week after week, it works a bit. And I did feel in a bit like I was getting to know him. And after 5 years together, I said, when he was leaving, I said, oh God, Danny, wasn't it funny when you first came here and you didn't talk at all? And he said, no. And I said, why? And he said, because that's how I get to know people. Like there's a whole lot I was learning about you, like about, you know, your aura, your spirit, your whatever. He said, you would always talk and then I have to start all over again.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, so I mean, even at the end, I hadn't quite learned what that was about. But I mean, Danny taught me a lot. I learned a lot. Like when I go to a party now, I don't go up to someone and say, hi, what do you do? How's your wife? Do you have kids? Where do your kids go to school? You know, I realized that for some people is incredibly invasive.
Yeah.
You know, and that's what white people do to make people feel at ease. And when you do that to a native, they just want to run out of the room.
Yeah, I guess that's true for any sort of cultural differences, right? And you have to be aware in some form or other that, you know, for example, in Japan, when I was there, you know, people said to me, if you want someone from Japan to come to you, you don't say, come here. That's looked upon as rude. You say, come here. And it's a subtle difference,
wow,
but it means a world
subtle.
of difference in Japan, right? So, you know, I understand how cultural differences can make a huge difference,
right?
Especially in an intimate relationship like a therapist, you know, client relationship.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Now, the other thing that was interesting too is there seem to be consistent themes running through all 5 encounters. You know, abandonment, withdrawal of love and care from parents or other members of the family, you know, psychological or physical abuse, that sort of thing. And the more I read that, the more I thought, could that be a template for most all dysfunction that people experience? It touches on those themes. Would that be fair to say?
Well, it has to touch, I chose those things because I wanted to show you how heroic some people could be. So a hero has to have a lot of things to fight.
Yeah.
Look at the Greeks, look at the myths, you find out, oh my God, they had to swim here, they had to save here, they had a monster here, they had Cyclops here. You have to be a hero, you have to confront things all the time. So that's why I chose people who had confronted a huge amount.
Yes.
Otherwise they wouldn't be heroes in the end. And I think trauma, if you want to define trauma, usually has sexual molestation in it. Not always. I mean, there's war trauma, but North American, basic household trauma usually has physical, sexual, emotional abuse.
Yeah. My wife has a theory. I'd like to run it by you.
Okay.
And her theory is that the age at which we've experienced our first traumatic event as a child is an age that we're kind of stuck at inwardly.
Absolutely.
So, for example, my father passed away when I was 13, traumatic event. I have a 13-year-old in me that pops out every now and then during stressful periods, etc. Does that make sense?
Makes total sense to me.
Okay.
I had a client who was Black, and she came here. She still is Black, actually, and she came here, and she had been sexually molested because she had to live with an aunt or something while her mother came here to make money, and then she married, and she had a child, and when that child was the same age where she was molested, she wouldn't let her out. And the husband said, "You've got to get help," because she was like, 12 years old, and she wouldn't let her go to birthday parties. She'd say there's going to be men there, all of this stuff. So it was at exactly the same age when no one was protecting her that she overprotected her daughter, right? And that whatever trauma, whatever hits you at a certain age, you got to realize that we're like trees growing up, right? Well, that whole year of your trauma, nothing's growing. You're in a black, dark room. You are not advancing at all, right? So you're stewing in this, and then you tend to go on again. But that when you look at a tree and it has a very bad year, you'll see that the ring isn't very wide. So I mean, if you have and I think the age at which you have trauma is important too. Like the younger, the worse.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the other question I have is, how do you balance the kind of objectivity that you kind of need with the connectivity with your client that you have to establish? How do you achieve that balance?
That's a really good question, because I definitely did struggle with that. I wouldn't describe, I love that you use the word connectivity instead of empathize, because let's look at Laura, for example. Remember Laura, the first case in the book, when she was abandoned by her father in a cabin with her when she was 8 with her younger brother and sister, and she had to take care of them because he said he was going for cigarettes, and then didn't come back. So I said to her, "Wow, that had to have been horribly hard. Like that must have been, wow, when you're 8 years old to have to do that." And she said, "Never Mr. Rogers me again. I don't want this Mr. Rogers treatment. Cut it out. I don't like it." Right. She said, "It brings up stuff in me that I don't want to look at. And I know I won't be able to go to work, and I won't be able to function. I don't want any of that stuff. So I don't want you to," she didn't know the word empathize. She was very naive when she came into therapy. She said, "So don't do it anymore." Right. So I found out that people that are truly traumatized very often don't want a lot of empathy, because they need someone strong. They don't want that's really hard. I know that must have been hard for you. Because it doesn't help them. And what they want is like, "Oh man, okay, what did you do then? And what can we do now? And how did that happen?" Right. So to sort of, I try really hard to look at it scientifically, or in terms of, this is a psych case. If you're given a psych case and say, "Okay, now how would you program this?" I'd like every week to have a plan what I'm going to do the next week, and try and have like 3 or 4 things that I want to try, so that I'm always looking at it as an intellectual problem and not an emotional problem. Right. But you're right, there has to be a connection, right? So what is the connection? And when I chose these people, I chose these 5, but I wanted to be objective. I wanted to have some, multicultural. I went through, it spent like 4 months going through all of my cases, summarizing them on 3x5 cards, all that stuff to try to make everything objective. And of course, in the end, I chose the first 5 people that I thought of. That I thought of first. It must be because I was connected with them, right? So I didn't realize that. And then my editor said to me, Kathy, are you aware that every woman in this book was raised by her father? And I said, no, I had no idea. And she said, yeah. She said, and I was raised by my father, if you've read Too Close to the Falls. I worked in my father's store from the age of 4. So I think part of my connectivity was that I really related to them as people, and it didn't matter what had happened to them. That connectivity comes from a shared experience of some kind.
Yes.
Yeah, that you're unaware of.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Speaking of Laura, she invoked the image of Colonel Potter from MASH as a kind of surrogate father figure, perhaps.
Right. When you talk about resilience, people often say to me, well, what is resilience, right? I mean, I think that was her most resilient moment. I mean, what happened is she's very able, when she's neglected children are often very capable because they've been neglected. They have to figure things out on their own, right? So she figured out how to, when her father was gone and she lived in that cabin, she made sure everybody went to school, everybody had new clothes every week because she stole them from Giant Tiger. She stole food. She had a whole elaborate system for doing that. But the children began to fail. I mean, her younger sister began crying all the time. Her younger brother, who was 5, began bedwetting. And she realized psychologically, this is not going well. But she thought, then she just said to herself, what am I going to do? I don't know how to be a mom and dad. But she didn't think that, she thought it was her fault. She'd say, it's my job to do this and I'm failing everyone. I don't know what to do. And then she was watching MASH, and on MASH, Colonel Potter, who is a doctor and a colonel and a very much of a father figure, said to Radar, who's very much of a boy figure, don't worry, son, we'll be home from the war. Everything will be okay. And, we hope we never have to do this again. And he had these aphorisms that he would share with Radar every week. And she really, really looked at him as a father figure. So then she said, this is what resilience is. You reach into the television screen and you say, that will be my father. That Colonel Potter will be my father forever. And that helped her enormously. Like whenever we would get to a dead end in the therapy, I'd say, what if your father had been Colonel Potter, what would he have said? And then she knew right away what to do and if she'd had that father. So she internalized him, and she later became very highly successful in what she did. And she said when she would get an award or something and there'd be no parent there, right, she'd always see Colonel Potter in the audience.
Yeah, interesting. And the same thing in a way with Peter, because Peter, it wasn't a person or an actor or a character, it was an actual object, a toy piano.
Yes.
That sort of did the same thing, that meant the same thing to him. Is that accurate?
Peter is, for those of you that haven't read that, Peter is a Chinese boy who was locked in a room for the first 5 years of his life. His parents ran a Chinese restaurant in a small town, and they locked him in there, and they only took him out at night to go to sleep. And he only had a tomato can in the room for defecation, and that's it. He had nothing else. So he had no language. He had no Chinese. He had no English. And when he was taken to the doctor, his sister came to my book launch, and told me that the doctor said, why is his head so flat? He suspected abuse, but she said she was too terrified to tell the doctor what her mother would do. But she felt tremendous guilt for that. But anyway, one day, some little kid left a piano, the kind that Peanuts has, a little tiny white one, left the piano in the restaurant. So the sister said, why don't you give it to Peter, right? And so the mother said, okay. So she dumped it in the room with him. And it's all he ever had. He had nothing else. He was in complete, a deprivation chamber, right? And so he would plunk the keys as hard as he could, and then he would hold it to his chest. And while it was at his chest, he would feel a reverberation, like you'd feel from a mother who's going like this, right? So it was like the mother was taking care of him. And then he began playing the piano, and he didn't understand really that he was playing the piano. He thought that the piano was happy when he was happy and was sad when he was sad. So that piano became his mother. And when I was doing research on him as an adult, Downbeat magazine said he's the only person that can squeeze every human emotion out of a piano.
Wow. So many of these,
I just want to say this one. People say, well, what's resilient? He actually was going under. You know, he was at the point where his mother was beating him with this bamboo whip, and he was in the corner. And he would think, poor Peter, he must really hurt. So this Peter had gone numb, and he was really leaving his body, like in the way that some of those Bulgarian orphans, you know, are just gone, right? They just left their body. And it was then when he got the piano that he said, he didn't consciously say this, but unconsciously he said, I'm going to use this. It's going to be my mother, and I'm going to make it.
Yeah. Wow. You know, I felt so powerfully, especially for Alana, and the sexual abuse she experienced, and all of that.
And all alone with no help from anyone ever.
You know, that's why I asked that question about objectivity and connectivity, because it would be very hard for me to stay objective as a therapist listening to a story like that. You know?
Well, one time I slipped. I think that's in the book. You were talking about things that you do wrong.
Yeah.
Because her father would put an apple on her head, and he thought it was very funny to try to shoot it off with a gun. And there was, you know, when the police came later, they found all those gun marks around. She said, and then he just would get drunk and pass out. I said, I said, how could you not pick up a gun and shoot him?
Yeah.
You know, after what he'd done to her, like, how could you, so, and then she looked at me and she said, I really feel like you know what I lived through. She said, because she said, your face was like purple and you really had a look of rage, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, it wasn't my most, my star moment as a therapist, empathizing, but it was a moment where I was saying, how the hell did you not pick up a gun? And because he just tortured you day after day after day. You know, but for her, that was a bonding moment. She said later, that was a big bonding moment for her because she felt like, wow, she gets it.
You know, the word forgiveness is kind of coming to me as we speak, because so many of these, of the five, maybe all of them, in some form or other, rationalized what had been done to them. Didn't, in a sense, blame the father, the mother, whoever. And I'm just
Not Alana. Not Alana.
She was, okay.
Alana always, she's the exception of that group. She said that one time her father had taken LSD and he was with a friend who's a pederast and had been in jail, and they built a raft. And I think this is in the book as well. I often forget what's in the book and what isn't because they cut some parts out. So they put them on, put her when she was 5 on a raft with her sister who was 4 on a raft. And then he got mad. He didn't feel like taking care of them anymore. And he said, you are nothing but 2 succubi, and screaming and yelling, etc. And they both went in the water, and then he just going to just let them go. So his friend on shore swam out, got them both back in. And he said, you fricking idiot. What, are you crazy? You can go to, I've been in jail. He said, you haven't been in jail. You have no idea. You almost killed these guys. He said, you are an effing idiot. You're crazier than anyone I've ever known. When she heard that, that was the best thing that she ever heard, because she thought, oh, there's something wrong with him. It's not all me.
Yeah.
Because he would call her sexually frigid. Oh, really, at age 5, right? So, she finally, she said that was her great dawning moment, so that she didn't go crazy then. She said, okay, she's got a high IQ. I think that's one of the things that really helped her. And she said, I get it. He's crazy. I'm stuck here, but I know now that I'm not the crazy one. And that was really important for her to realize. And but she always saw him as bad as he was. But not Laura.
Right.
Not Peter. But
is there room, or is there a place for forgiveness? That idea in therapy like that? I mean,
whatever gets you through the night. You know,
Okay.
and I think it depends what kind of person you are. Peter he was born kind. He's just a kind man. Like if somebody was crying in my waiting room, which someone was one time, he went out and bought her a coffee, and he didn't say anything to her, anything, just left it there for her. And you know, he's just got a kind side to him. And he was, and I learned a lot from him. I learned a lot about kindness from him. Like I'd say, well, aren't you angry at your mother? Also, the mother killed the father because he was a diabetic, and she made him eat fried donuts every day.
Oh.
Say, time for your fried donuts, right? And then, you know, the
Wow.
doctor, yeah. So, I mean, it was a kind of a slow homicide. It was very odd. And so I said, aren't you angry at her? He said, no, I'm not. He said, no one would want to do this. No one would want to be like this. She's something happened. She can't be any other way. But nobody would want to be mean, because he couldn't picture being mean. Like it wasn't part of his makeup at all.
So he was a forgiving soul.
He's just
to
a
begin
forgiving
with.
soul.
Yeah.
He's, you know, I went to Catholic school for, you know, my youth. Not that it ever helped, but you know, we all the time we would hear about forgiveness, and you know, God forgave us our sins. Forgiveness was a huge thing, and it just never resonated with me, right? Because I guess I wasn't a forgiving person in the depths of my being. But I learned a lot from him about forgiveness, because he's right. Why would anyone want to be that way? You know, and he was being genuine, right? And then his problem, of course, then was with the book, because he said, my mother going to look really bad in this book, and I don't want her to, right? And I thought, how can a mother who locks someone away, who kills their husband, how can we make them look good? You know, I said, what are we going to do? So originally I had 10 cases. So I got rid of 5 cases, and I only had 5 in the book, but I made them longer.
Yeah.
So I went back a generation to what had happened to Peter's mother. And, you know, Peter's mother was in a cocaine den and for sadomasochism in Vietnam. And it's a very long story, but her mother allowed her to be a torture victim, right? So she would say to Peter, why are you so angry at me? Right. I did everything for you. I saved you from ever being touched by anyone. Like, you should be thanking me. I don't get it. You know, so when you actually heard all the stuff that happened to her, she was a way better mother than her mother had been. Right. You know, so, I mean, some of these people were so bad that I had to go back in a generation to say, what formed them? You know, he was a little, as Peter said to me, she was once a little baby who wanted to be loved. You know, something happened.
I have a couple more questions for you, and then we're going to go to a Q&A.
Sure.
Can you talk about the writing process of the book? I mean, did you use techniques that you used in your other memoirs, After the Falls, etc.?
No, the memoirs were so easy in comparison, because you need for every book you need a through line, right? So my through line was the spine of all my memoirs was what happened. You know, what happened when I was 3, 4, 5, 6, and all of those incidents, I could just write them down and then write them out. And it was just so easy to do, right? And then when I wrote my novel, then, you know, I realized that I got way carried away with it being 400 pages, and, you know, because I'm the type that does much better if I have a structure, and it can't go away from that structure. So that's what was good about the memoirs. Now with the book, I gave it, I wrote it, and I was in it, you know, in the way that I'm in it now, and I gave it to an agent that I had at the time, no longer have, and said, you know what? It's not a memoir. Why are you in it? Nobody wants you in it. People want to hear about the cases. They don't want to hear about you. You know, you're used to writing a memoir, and you're used to putting yourself in. It doesn't work. 2 years took to get all of me out. So I'm just a presence, right? Give it to my new agent, and she says, where are you? Where are you? You're not in the book. She said, we want to know what you're thinking, what you're feeling.
Right.
You know, that's, and also, how else are you going to teach what psychology is without knowing what you're going through as a psychologist? It's teaching people what psychologists go through. Oh, so another year and a half, I have to put it all back in.
Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, it was really hard to do. And plus, I think when you're in this field, everybody has an occupational hazard. Every field has its occupational hazard, you know.
Yeah.
Miners have asbestosis, or, you know, whatever. Okay. The psychologists have heard too much evil. We've heard too many bad things. So we're a bit immune. So when I wrote Alana, it was twice as long. And my editor at Penguin said, I can't read this. I can't read this. It's horrible. It's too horrible to read. I said, oh. So then I said, no, I think it's because you're older. Give it to somebody, give it to some young editors. They couldn't get through it. She said, nobody can read this.
Oh.
So I cleaned up the whole thing and just put in a little bit. And what I thought was a little bit. And still, everybody that reads the book says, I could hardly finish Alana.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I had no idea what was too much, because I was looking at it all from an intellectual point of view, and people that reading it are reading it from an emotional point of view.
That's right.
You know,
That's right.
so I really went over the top in a lot of those cases, right?
Mm-hmm.
We're saying, you know, especially with the Alana case, because there was torture you couldn't imagine, right? So, and I thought it was really fascinating to put all the torture in so that you could say, and she wound up sane.
Well, that's the heroic part.
Yeah, totally
right?
heroic.
Yeah.
So I said, we have to have all that in. They said, no, you don't. You can have 1/8 of that, which is what is in the book.
Okay.
So
Wow.
they were right in the end.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Incredible what
Yeah.
goes into a book. People don't know often. They
No.
get it, right?
And I mean, sometimes editors are marvelous, right? And
Yeah.
sometimes they're not.
Okay. One final question for you before we go to Q&A.
Okay.
This is an oddball question.
Okay.
But I have to ask it.
An
because you're a
oddball question.
Because you're a therapist,
Yeah.
right? So I want you to imagine you're still doing therapy and the population of the planet walks in the door filled with the angst and the stress and the worry and everything that people are feeling these days around this pandemic. How would you handle that client?
I would say to that client that all of these feelings are real. And we're all feeling it. You know, just read the New York Times every day. You know, all the columns are about, you know, I'm depressed. I don't care if I wear socks. You know, I can, you know, every day is the same as the next. You know, I can't teach my children. I'm going to go out of my mind. This is all written up. But if you're actually feeling that you can't cope with that, then you need to talk about your life before the pandemic, because there's a whole lot buried there. Because I mean, the pandemic is bad. You know, I mean, if, you know, some people have like no money, no job, no whatever. These are all real problems. They're not psychiatric problems. They're real problems, right? I mean, not that, you know, psychiatric problems are real too, but, you know, they're real world problems. But like I was talking to my dentist the other day, and he said, every day somebody's crying in his office. So I said, over what? And he said, the pandemic. They're just panicked by it.
Yeah.
Right. So I would say to those people, let's talk about what it means to be alone. Let's talk about what it means to have something in your life that's unsure. What happened? What about uncertainty terrifies you? And I think you'd find a lot of stuff if you went back. Because I mean, I think that, you know, the pandemic is just kind of a Rorschach. You know, it's just a picture, and then you throw all your unconscious stuff on top of it.
Right. Right. Okay, I'm going to make an appointment for next week.
Yes,
if you don't mind.
Thank you very much. No crying in the waiting room.
Okay. So listen, thank you very much, Catherine. This was a wonderful conversation.
Thank you. You did a great job.
Thank you. Really enjoyed it. And we're going to turn it over to Lauren
Hi, Lauren.
for a question and answer period.
Hello, everyone. This is actually Shannon here. I'll relay some of those questions that have been coming through. So thank you, Harry, and thank you, Catherine.
Thank you. I can't hear a thing, but anyway.
Oh, you can't hear me? Can you hear me a bit better now?
No.
Okay, just 1 second.
Just be louder.
Okay, well, I think just to piggyback on what Harry was just saying, that I think after everybody reads this book, a lot of them, one of their first questions is going to be, are you still taking clients? Because they might be interested in visiting with you.
Oh, I think that you said, are you taking clients? That was what I heard at the end there. No, I stopped being a therapist when I was 50. I ran out of empathy. One day it was gone. No, I'm just kidding. But at 50, I'd heard so many problems from so many people and so many stories that what happened was I said, I want to write my own story. So I didn't become a writer until I was 50. And then, so for the last 20 years, I've been a writer and not a psychologist.
Okay, so that brings us to our next question. Going off when you said you ran out of empathy. So
I was just kidding.
No, I know. We can imagine that it'd be very difficult, to hear the stories that you're hearing every day. And how do you remain, in a way, disconnected from those stories and not keep them from affecting you? So not allow those stories to sort of taint your view of humanity.
I never, ever, ever have given a talk about this book that someone doesn't ask that. Always someone asks it. And I always find it completely surprising. So it must have something to do with me. I think that I look at the job not as one, I look at it as an intellectual task where I'll read and say, maybe I should do this, maybe I should do that. And I don't look at the torture these people have gone through and I don't put myself in their position. I put myself in the position of how can I help this specific person and what technique will work the best. So I have like graph paper and I graph out little arrows and and mountains and charts saying this is what I'm going to do. If this happens, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. But then I thought about it, and I have some friends that are therapists and they don't take those kinds of cases on because they say, I can't stand that kind of stuff. I go home at night, I'm depressed, I'm blah, blah. And I think, I think it depends the way you were raised. I worked for my father in my father's drugstore from the time I was 4 years old. And the doctor said I was hyperactive and he said I needed a job. And my mother said, well, who's going to hire a 4-year-old? Right. So my father said, who owned a drugstore? I will. But then I would go to people's houses to deliver the medication. And sometimes you'd find people dying or you'd find people who couldn't even reach their medication on the table. And I would call my father and say, this person's too sick to even take their medication. He'd say, you've got to move on. We've got antibiotics that have to be here by 8 o'clock. We've got diabetes medication where the person's in shock. They've got to have this. So it's not your job. It's your job to deliver this and to move on. And I think I learned, as a lot of males learn at an early age, to compartmentalize. Just compartmentalize and say, okay, this isn't, my job isn't to feel sorry for this person. My job is to relate to what they're feeling. And what's the word you use instead of empathize? I love that
Connectivity.
word. Connectivity. I really like that word, right? Because connectivity is like where, Alana feels, hey, I'm with you, as opposed to I'm feeling sad for you, right? So I honestly never did take it home.
Okay, our next question is, trauma affects each person so differently. What are a few red flags that may indicate someone is dealing with a traumatic past?
Well, I can give you the classic symptoms because I've dealt with Vietnam War vets when I worked in New York. One of them is hyperactivity, hypersensitivity. Because what happens when you're in war is you have to look around all the time. If you're a sniper or whatever, you're doing a 360 all the time. So whenever they're there, they're hyper alert. This kind of hyper alert business. And when you see people that are going like this, in fact, I had a client who went to a Vietnamese restaurant with some friends and passed out. He was so hyper alert to all of the Vietnamese people in the restaurant that, he thought somebody was going to pull a gun out of, in New York City at a Vietnamese restaurant. So that's one. That's one. Another one is that trigger temper, where especially with males who've had war trauma, where, if someone says, we don't have you, what was one of the clients, they said, I'm sorry, you can't drink a Pepsi in this store, because it can go on the, our merchandise. Throwing the Pepsi can against the wall and saying, who are you to tell me? That sort of people that are, all their feelings are so close to the surface that that they pop out, right? I would say those are two of them. With females, it's a lot harder to tell. A lot. I know I'm being stereotypical here, but because males, instead of absorbing pain, they throw it out as rage. Women absorb pain. They hurt themselves. You know, whenever you see people that have self-mutilated or severe depression, that pain has gone inward. Right? But I mean, if you met somebody like Alana works at a university. She's, you know, she's her student. She's her, what's it called? Rep for her union. She does all of these. You wouldn't know that she's been traumatized. It's all, you know, it's all in her head.
And this brings us to our next question. If you are seeing these sorts of red flags, should you, or maybe you just know about past trauma with this individual, should you encourage them to recognize the trauma in a family that happens from one generation to the next, and encourage them to get help?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. But people that have been truly traumatized very often don't want help, because part of what they feel is, I mean, I think Alana came to me only because the person she lived with made her come and said, you have to get help. Because when people are traumatized, they've got themselves, as Alana said, glued together. I'm barely glued together. And if I start taking one piece out of this puzzle, the whole thing is going to fall apart. I'm managing to keep it together now. Why on earth would I want to go and start pulling these pieces out and then the legs fall off? You know, so also, if someone has been traumatized, it's good to see someone who knows trauma, because you learn to go inch by inch. And sometimes if you go too fast, they really, it's a trigger. Like, for example, Alana said, I can't read your book. Write whatever you want. I'm not reading your book, because it's a trigger for me. It's who I was, and I can't look at that. If I have to look at that, I'm afraid, you know, the symptoms will come back. I've been lucky so far. So, you know, you got to be careful of triggers.
I think that the patience that we saw you show throughout the book was remarkable. And I think it was a good reminder for us in our own relationships and our own interactions that sometimes, you know, timing really is everything. And maybe having that patience to have certain conversations, or instead of, you know, giving or explaining everything that we're feeling all at once, to sort of take that time with the person that we're wanting to have the conversation with and allow them to come to it. And we saw you do that with your patients. You had thoughts and things you wanted to say, but you would pull back and say, now is not the time.
Right, right. Yeah, I mean, whenever you say to yourself, this is what I said to myself, because my problem is being too forthright, and that's not good for a therapist. So what I would say to myself is, you know, I think it's the right time for me to say to her, da 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 da. And then I would say, no, if I think it's the right time, hold back. Until, you know, knowing that that's my foible, right? And say, I'm going to hold back, because you can always do it the next week. And very often the next week, someone will come in and say, you know what I said last week? It made me think. And then they come through with their own stuff. And whenever a therapist points out something to a client, it can be insight and they can get better, but they do way better by coming up with it on their own. If they come up with it on their own, it really tends to lead more toward cure. I don't know why that is, but it's, you know, well, I guess it's the same thing as, you know, watching a TV show on how to, you know, build a model plane as opposed to building one yourself. You get into it and you figure out how to do it.
Earlier, you were talking about connectivity, and Harry commented on how difficult that differentiation is between being objective and also establishing a relationship. And I think we saw that with Danny. At one point, you described him feeling like a brother to you. And so I wonder how you work through that sort of sudden loss of that relationship and that connection. It must be hard to let them go at times, even when they're ready.
I think he was my hardest to let go. I think he was, because I used to, I saw how tremendously difficult the therapy was for him. He used to stand outside of my office and walk up and down for a half an hour and smoke a million cigarettes. And I could tell he was very anxious, but he pushed himself to go. And I admired that. And I also admired how much he grew as a person. And I felt I knew him from being a baby to being an adult, and his ability to, and when he actually then began to send me patients, because he became very involved in the Native movement. And he said he would just send me a one-line postcard and said, I'm sending someone for a retread. Right, because he loved cars. He loved cars. And he loves all that stuff. Yeah, but yeah, no, that was very hard. And when I heard that he died, I called his boss because I wanted to get together with him for lunch and tell him that I was writing the book. And then when I found out that he died so soon after we finished the therapy, so soon after he'd found a wonderful woman and had started a new life, that to me was so sad.
Yes, I know personally, I definitely shed some tears when that part of the story came, because I think when you're reading it and you're hearing about all this horror, you're really hanging on as the reader to that hope of when you do reconnect with them. As a reader, we can't wait to hear, where are they now? How have they persevered and continue to persevere? Because this trauma doesn't never really leave them. And it was heartbreaking to hear that he did die so soon after, because he had so much to give, and he was true to his Indigenous roots, teaching and passing on that wisdom and encouraging that growth.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And he did not want to go back to those native roots. That was our biggest fight. And I had to find a way to fight with him without actually fighting, because I can only push people so far. But all of the healers and all of the native people in the mental health field said he's not going to be well just with your therapy. It's just white people's therapy. He needs to be at one with the universe, and he needs to go to smudges. He needs to go to powwows. He needs to do all of the things that he did from the ages of 1 to 5 when he was a native, before it was taken away from him. Remember, residential school taught you that being a, quote, as he said to me, being an Indian is bad, but you're a savage. You must never speak the Cree language. And he got terribly beaten for speaking it. And he had to confess every Saturday in confession that he was a savage. So if you teach someone every day that they're being an Indian, which that's what the term they used then, was bad, then of course they're going to absorb it. But guess what? They never gave him anything. They never gave him a white self. They just said the native self was bad. So he was like man without a country.
So we have another question here, and I know it's something we often hear. When a person has been a victim, can they only heal if they forgive their assailant?
Right. I'm only laughing here because I think of Alana. And Alana, would she have forgiven Art? And he sort of went off the charts. I mean, he was in the Ted Bundy fan club. I mean, many people, so that gives you an idea of where he's at. And he did one cruel, sadistic thing after another. And then one time she was reading my book and about something that had happened with my dad. And she suddenly thought, oh my God, there could be relationships that are good with your dad. I didn't know that. So she called him on the phone. Her sister said, I think you're having a nervous breakdown for calling him, but she called him, and then she said, I remember once we looked at the, Aurora Borealis? Yeah, Aurora Borealis. You woke me up in the night and we watched the whole thing happen. And he said, oh yeah, I remember that. And so then he said, you should come out and see me sometime. And she just chatted for a minute. And it was a really good thing that she did, because he had one of those whiskey voices. He'd smoked so much that he could hardly talk. He was wheezing. And she thought, this is the man that terrified me. He's just this little, guy who has, lung problems, right? And he's not so scary. But then, she said she would never go to see him. That would be ridiculous. So she just hung up the phone. But she did do that. And then later, remember that part in the book where it's just so ironic that she and one other person were getting the award for they're all in this gaming thing. I don't know anything about gaming, but you get on and you shoot people and you do this and you do that, and then you make plans of how to shoot them in other ways. She was competing with one other person, and it turned out it was him. It was a father-daughter thing, and that each of them had, it's like, wow, do you have the same genes or what? But then when the father died, she said she didn't care. And so then when her she said, okay, I said, who are you? How did you win all these awards? She wins all these awards from these gaming places. And she said, because under every rock, behind every tree, I think it's art, and I go for them.
Wow.
So, and you know, she's really good at it. And she's one of the few people that's written these female game programs where, you know, there's female heroes, et cetera, because most women don't get into this, but she's totally into it. So there's somebody who didn't forgive, but who said, I see him for what he is, and I'm using that anger to get ahead in the game system. I'm getting rid of my anger that way. But was she forgiving? No. And you know, there wasn't a lot there to forgive.
It seemed for a lot of them, they had to forgive themselves because they blamed themselves. And you pointed out to them that, you know, it wasn't you at all. This happened to you. And so there was a theme of forgiveness for themselves throughout.
Oh, that was the worst thing with Laura. Laura, she forever thought that she should have been able to take better care of her brother and sister. When she was 8 years old. That's why I took her to a classroom of 8-year-olds. And I said, look at these children. This is what you were expected to give breakfast, lunch, and dinner to and manage in the woods. They're 8 years old. And then when we got in the car, I thought for sure she's seen this and recognized it. And she said, wow, they were immature. So in other words, she still saw herself as, that was my job. I don't know about what these little kids are like. They seem really immature. It took her about 4 years to actually realize what she was at that age, because her father said, I trust you. I know you can do this. You can take care of everything. I can go anywhere. You're in charge, and I love you for that. Everyone will do what they're loved for again and again and again and not ask any questions. It's really hard to deprogram that.
And we just have, I don't see any more questions coming through. So if you do have a question, please post it now. But we do have a comment. What a great session. The interviewer was excellent. Kathy was very interesting, and this has made me want to read the book again.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you, Harry. That was a terrific interview, thoughtful questions. And thank you, Catherine. I mean, it's just amazing to pick your brain a little more about the book. For those who have not read the book, or any of Catherine's books for that matter, we have copies of them in our collection here at the library. Do come put them on hold. You can get them by coming into the Mill Street Library, or you could do our curbside pickup service. It's amazing the engagement that we can still have today, even though it's virtual. So thank you everyone for your patience. I know it's a bit different to attending a virtual program. There's some glitches and technical difficulties. So thank you so much for your patience. I hope you enjoyed. As I mentioned, this is recorded and it will be posted on our YouTube channel later this week if you did miss some bits or you want to circle back. Thanks again, everyone, and enjoy your afternoon.